Hello and welcome to Ravlic at Large. My name's Tom Ravlic. Thank you for joining me for this particular episode. This one's being recorded just on Christmas Eve in Melbourne, Australia. And it's probably not a bad thing to do, given it's the last episode in the first series of 8, to look back at what's been going on in the firstly in the economic space, in the accounting world, and a few other bits and pieces thrown in. And who I couldn't think of anybody better to do this with than Lisa Greig, who's a principal at Perigee Advisors. She's a tax agent. She also lectures in taxation and trains people up so they know what's going on. So Lisa and I are going to have a bit of a natter about where things have got to and where things may be heading in the new year. Lisa, thanks for joining me.
Absolute pleasure, Tommy. Absolute pleasure.
Now, we've both watched a whole heap of stuff happen from the start of the year to now. Let's work backwards, because some people who are already in holiday mode won't be aware of the fact that there's a whole bunch of people who, while having to attempt to switch off, and they've got the world around them, be it family and others, there are things coming out that are at times mission critical for them towards the end of the year. We've had something happen today with the ART. Now, we need to explain to people that the old Administrative Appeals Tribunal, the AAT, has been replaced by a thing they call the ART.
Yep, I'm glad they picked a nice acronym. It could have been worse, but anyway.
It's a bit arty, but that's okay.
Yes.
We'll give them that
It's
much.
administrative, not judicial, so it's allowed to be a little bit more arty. Maybe.
Arty. Yeah, I guess that's okay. But if we take this arty thing that we now have,
yeah,
and with me trying to keep a straight face,
yeah, we don't have
to. What's
Christmas
actually
Eve.
happened? No, well, who cares? What's happened today?
Oh, what's happened today? Oh, okay. I thought you were going to continue on and answer your own question. No, what's happened today? So, with the transition from the AAT to the ART, we haven't been getting any of the decisions published. And there's been lots of us discussing it because my peers that do updates on tax and my fellow facilitators, lecturers, presenters, whatever collective noun you want to use for us.
I'll think of something shortly.
Oh yeah, we can have a collective noun of CPDers. We've been waiting to see when these decisions start getting published, because it gives us a bit of an insight into what's going on. And today they've finally dropped some, which is fantastic. We've now got a whole, however months it's been since it's changed over, we've got a whole number of decisions now that we can have a bit of a read. And for us nerdy types, they're actually sometimes pretty fun to read because of them being administrative, not judicial. They're pretty easy reading. There's usually really good stories. The last ones that have come through have been very much around individual taxpayers, maybe trying to claim outrageous deductions, and so we always have a bit of a giggle about it, going, did they really think they'd be able to get those through? And of course the ATO pick them up and say, hey, you can't claim that, and they go, we'll take it to the AAT or the ART now to do that. So they've dropped all these great decisions for us to have a bit of a read over our Christmas break, so nothing really stops if we want to stay abreast of these sort of things. And that's what's happened today. But we've had a lot of things that have dropped over the past few days, as you and I have been discussing.
Well, if we take one of the more significant ones that dropped yesterday, being the 23rd, there was Treasurer Jim Chalmers and the Attorney General Mark Dreyfus dropped the discussion paper on legal professional privilege, and that topic has been at the centre of many a tax dispute between the tax office and advisors and tax office and taxpayers, and also in the middle of the evergreen and still continuing PwC matter.
That you've been covering in a lot of your articles that you've been writing, Tom. So,
I'm
exactly.
looking forward to forget about it for 5 minutes and focus on Pokemon, but that's another matter altogether. But if we take the LPP document, it hits on the 23rd of December. Now I know that the government's given people the opportunity to respond with a bit more of a generous time frame than they normally would.
Well, is it generous or is it appropriate? Because we've got to the 28th of Feb now, because a lot of our discussion papers and our responses have been very, very short, especially when they were trying to get the government was trying to get things through before the end of the sitting weeks as well, Tom. So I would say that this would be appropriate amounts of consultation.
But if we look at it, if you take the break period and you've got a fortnight, so the government could argue they're giving people about 2 months.
Well, they're giving him a month, I reckon, because Australia doesn't come back till after Australia Day, really. Sorry, are we allowed to call it Australia Day?
We are allowed to call it Australia Day.
It's still a public holiday, so I'll still call it the Australia Day public holiday. That's when most people come back, because it's when school goes back. So, if we look at the break that we're having now, we've got Christmas to New Year, which is basically no person land. Like no one sort of gets out of what, we ask ourselves what day it is because we don't know. And then after that, we've then got probably a date of being like the 6th, people start taking off their out of office. But then a lot of us who have got families and kids at school and everything won't come back till after the Australia Day public holiday. So if you look at that time frame, it's been released yesterday, so we can have a think about it, so it's always in the back of our mind. But what we've got now is we've probably got a solid month to actually respond to it in any shape or form.
Well, now, if you're a sole practitioner or in a small firm, you may be able to do that reasonably well. But when you are somebody that's in a membership body, your ability to respond to some of this stuff can be very limited, because you want to go out there and consult. You need to talk to people. And for about a month of that time, your constituents are basically on the beach or somewhere in the US, probably Aspen, going for a bit of a ski.
Oh, I think a lot of people skiing in Japan at the moment, but anyway, good example.
Well, Japan's another good example, which is fine. I mean, whatever floats anybody's boat. The point being, for about a month, people are AWOL when it comes to their professional intellect, which is entirely appropriate. But it means that a policy advisor sitting in one of the 3 accounting bodies or one of the legal associations or whatever else doesn't have the same pool of talent or constituents to draw on, which means it's still, frankly, as
I said, they've given
not
us
enough time, ladies and gentlemen.
Oh, that's a bit of a Canavan sign, Tom.
He's better. He's got a television with the sign on. Rob's got me.
Put it on the back of your merch behind you.
Well, like this.
That was
not enough time.
Canavan sign.
It's a makeshift Canavan sign.
However, Tom, look, we've had a lot of consultation. There's been a lot of PJCs, there's been a lot of estimates and things like that. And if you look at the LPP one that came out, and I must admit I have not looked at it in any detail. It was just more, it's come out and I've read the presser to see what sort of it's covered without going into detail. They have already consulted to some extent, or I think the discussion paper curbs around previous discussions. So the question is, based on the experience that we've seen over the past, say, 6 months of consultation, is it just a ticker box exercise that's going on? I'm going there. Is it a ticker box exercise? And they already know what they're going to do? Yeah, too many inquiries. All right, we're going down that path. I feel like we're in Love Actually, and you're putting down the signs. Now that's probably more appropriate.
I haven't got Butcher's paper. I didn't
Yeah,
bring
I know
any.
you've done it in chalk and Butcher's paper, but you know I love my movies, so that's where I'm heading to. I love my trivia. But do they already know the answer they want, and they know the result they want anyway? So how the royal we, me being a member of quite a few professional bodies, and I see the work that those advocates do in any shape or form, there's a lot of time spent. Is it really worth the time of doing it when sometimes the discussions have already been had and they know exactly the output that they want? And I think we saw some of that with some of the short time frame discussions that occurred in areas out of my expertise prior to the end of the parliamentary sitting, 2024.
I think the one you're referring to, and one I did some work on myself and interviewed people on, was the social media ban for under 16s, where the legislation popped up on a Thursday. An inquiry was announced, and people had 24 hours to respond to the call for submissions. That inquiry held a public hearing of no more than 4 hours duration max. The legislation then made its way into Parliament, passed by the House of Representatives, got to the Senate, and by the end of the Thursday night, before people closed the books off for the year, this legislation had been passed. Now, there was a motley crew of people that opposed it, being considered in that form and at that time, from the Australian Greens to several people from the coalition who were vociferously against it. You had some crossbenchers who tend to stretch it a bit in terms of the slippery slope argument, which we understand. If somebody thinks that a social media ban for under 16s is a stalking horse for a digital ID for everybody, and that leads to digital currency and ultimate digital control, it's difficult to persuade some of those people if there's not been a good, solid due process. And then, of course, Richard Colbeck, in a very pithy contribution, essentially said, well, he couldn't vote for it because the process had not been thorough enough. So that's one example of it. But we also, the preceding 12 months, we saw the same thing happen with aspects of Tax Agent Services Act amendments.
Exactly. That's what I was thinking of.
Where you got the amendments related to membership of the TPB, the board itself, and then you had aspects of the requirements to drop in and be more active about the way in which you monitor fellow practitioners or yourself, or whatever have you, which then flowed on to the tax determination. But that then ended up being a disaster in its own right, because that was exposed in early December of 2023. The date for comment closed before Australia Day, if I remember correctly. So it was a month, theoretically, with a whole bunch of people going on leave.
Yep.
And then the ultimate irony of this is something that could have been sewn up quite easily had the consultation period actually existed and was actually proper. It occupied people's minds all the way through to October this year.
Correct.
So if you look at, I know Richard Colbeck thinks that social media uh, legislation is probably the example where it's not how to do legislation. The equivalent and ridiculous and bizarre example is the tax determination, because the minister made a rod for his own back in the way in which that was done, then issued in July. Then the professions all of a sudden woke up from their slumber. They tend to be fairly quiet and try and be polite to government. Instead, they went out of their way to tell people that they didn't like what was being done, including an ad campaign, which is kind of unprecedented. Which I still disagree with, given my background. But yes, it was a classic example of how not to do something.
Exactly. And that's where I think when we've got the announcements that came out and the discussions like on LPP that came out, only yesterday? Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
That it's an adequate discussion period where we're used to having a really tight time frame or an inappropriate time frame to do it. So consultation, and we look at the history of what's meant to happen, we're meant to have robust conversation and enough time to do things. And these, even look at the process, Tom. I mean, the input that you gave, you were not getting paid for. You're not on some hourly rate to give consultation. You look at what us, the members of the membership bodies, do. We do that out of our own free will and time as well.
Correct.
And then when you think about it, it's our membership dollar that pays for the advocates in these memberships. So we're paying for it as well. And so don't underestimate the time it takes to put in submissions. And that's where I really think that it needs to be adequately addressed if we're putting our time into it as well to do this. I look at things like, when we were on the couch during COVID, and we're in lockdown Melbourne, we knew what it was all about. And there was people that were still getting paid really good hourly rates to control what we do when we weren't getting paid our hourly rates at that time as well. So I think it's a matter of, I think, respect as well as trust in us providing our input to these things. And without that input, Tom, I'm just looking at it, without that input, I looked at the media ban, and that's in an area that I don't know anything about except for being a user, that you've got to look at the big picture. You may look at some little issue, which TASA and the Code of Conduct was trying to address. You've got to look at the repercussions of that and all the stakeholders. And without adequate consultation, you don't understand the ripple effect of those things. And that's what I would really appreciate, more time and consideration of the inputs that we provide in these sort of discussion papers.
But the point you raise is valuable, because if you look at any reasoned and rational process for the evaluation of regulatory impact, existing and proposed, you need to break it down in terms of the impact on the people and organisations that must immediately comply, their intermediaries, the people they talk to and engage to help them with that compliance, the users of any information that may be produced as a result of that compliance task, how that information needs to be communicated to those in charge of governance of an entity, before it filters its way outside into the hands of people who might be interested in it. Government departments who collect it, the regulators who police it, to some extent, the media that reports on it, although the media tends to be a fourth or fifth order consideration in these discussions because the media will get whatever it's given, right? It doesn't have an active role in saying, hey, listen, if you permit these entities to not lodge financial statements on the ASIC register because you've increased the threshold for small proprietary companies.
Mm-hmm.
The media is not a consideration. Is not a consideration in that process, and yet the work they do is relied upon by the community to understand how some entities operate and how some entities might engage in less than ethical practice in conducting their business. So, and in some ways, there's also a need for the media itself to think more carefully about how it should participate in some of this accounting and disclosure stuff. Because when things change, it immediately impacts the degree of transparency.
Correct.
And in fact, there's something else that goes on. If you have new disclosure that is complicated and jargon laden, it may as well not be there for most of the media cohort because the buggers wouldn't understand it anyway.
And then what
It's
we
not
find
their
happens is,
expertise.
well, and that's, you've got an accounting qualification, Tom, so you're a lot more attuned to writing something in this space. However, what we find with the general finance media, if we can call it that, they just seem to just rehash the media release and drink the Kool-Aid without actually looking into depth about what it actually means. And that doesn't matter whether it comes from, a regulator, a political party, or whatever. And that's the disappointment. Look further into it, because the readers of this information do have expertise in it, right? And we've also got to look at where the information's coming from. So we've got to look at, is there a vested interest? What are they trying to sell to us in any shape or form?
Well,
that messaging, Tom.
Yeah, you're right. The other thing is source capture. Mm-hmm. It's what Sky News' Paul Murray talks about as the access world. And the trade-off between getting material from the sausage machine to being more critical about what's coming out of the sausage machine, and then finding people are less likely to be dropping things in people's inboxes that look like exclusives because of the manner in which something may have been reported. So you're seeing various elements of a reliance on authority. That is, if ASIC says something on accounting and auditing, it must be important because ASIC is the regulator. Whereas if you look at the auditing and accounting surveillance work they do, there's been an ever declining number of sets of working papers that they've looked at. Now,
and that's looking at the data and understanding what's getting presented to you. And that's the critical thinking that we do.
It's the 100. If it was 150 sets of working papers, I would take the result and the engagement ASIC has with, actual audit working papers more seriously. But if the number is under 20, I think the last time it was about 15. If it's under 20, it's nowhere near an adequate representation of audit quality in this country. Now, there will be people who look at anything the regulator says and it said, well, this is an indication audit quality is poor. Says who? Regulator? Oh, yeah, but on what basis? How many did they look at? And that becomes your problem with the empirical. The empirical question becomes more important than the performative one. right? Oh, we've looked at 15. We found X in these numbers. Oh, we've done it on a risk basis. Well, they may have done it on a risk-based assessment, but it certainly doesn't represent the entirety of the population of listed company audits. It certainly wouldn't represent the audit quality you would find in the listed company audit population with the private, private company or proprietary company population, and then the not-for-profits that need to report in accordance with the law and lodge stuff with the ACNC, and anybody else that gets reviews done because they're allowed to use somebody to do a review of their numbers because they're not big and important enough to do an audit.
And what I find, Tom, is that it then becomes sensationalized. But what we really want to look at is what's their role and what's the output? What's it for? What does it mean? What is the impact of this?
Well,
Can we not trust anything, or do we trust only some things? Or what? But why is this coming out, and why are they doing that audit? For what purpose? And then what is the repercussions? What's the hand smack that happens? Because, when we come down to different PJCs and estimates and things like that, we're looking at who's holding who to account and what they're trying to do. Bringing it back to TASA and the Code of Conduct that I'm intimately familiar with, we want trust in the profession and we want trust in the tax system. And that's really what we're coming down to. And did the issues that's trying to be addressed with this Code of Conduct, did it actually achieve what it's trying to achieve or not? Are the unregistered agents, are the people that are doing the wrong thing going to be continuing doing the wrong thing? Are they preaching to the already converted? And that's one of the things. Don't regulate for regulate's sake unless it's going to actually give you the desired outcome. And that's the same in the audit space that you've been looking at and you're intimately involved in. What are we trying to achieve by doing this? Or what's the regulators, how is it trying to protect the public and the citizens of Australia?
Well, regulation in some respects, and I haven't written this yet, so it's probably my first published articulation.
I've given you some copy to write, Tommy.
No, you haven't given me copy to write. This has been sitting in my mind for a while, but
of course, we flush things out.
But regulation needs to be more like acupuncture rather than some sort of broad-based campaign to change law to whack everybody over the head for the sins of one organisation or one individual. Let me articulate that in a slightly different way because people might think I'm being overly ponderous. Acupuncture deals with the placement of needles on a specific nerve, and if you know what motivates people in a profession, if you know where the tension points or the nerve points are, you're able to target those well and target those deliberately, and you don't need to go beyond that.
Instead of waterboarding everyone.
Well, yes. It's one way of putting it.
I watch too much television.
And I've read too many books about 9/11, but that's neither here nor there. If we take the way in which TASA, the Tax Agent Services Act amendments were proposed and then dealt with in the Principal Act and also in the regulation, you saw a bunch of things that were being put into place that would impact everybody. Whereas if you dealt with the one case that presented itself in the public domain and you dealt with it well, and I know this is sounding a bit medieval, but there's nothing like a half-decent head on a spike for people to take notice. You don't need to do much to get accounting professionals and similar professionals to fear the process. We go back to Machiavelli. I mean, Machiavelli's great um, contribution to political discourse was, well, if you could choose between, if you had to choose between being loved and being feared, and you only had the choice of one or the other, which is it? And Machiavelli falls on the side of being feared. Understandably so. As long as you're not hated, you're okay. If you're hated, you might get overthrown by somebody who decides it's time for you to go. That then takes you down the pathway of a conversation you and I have had on many occasions, and not necessarily on a platform like this, which is you then look at what accountants and similar professionals fear. And for all the complexity and for all the training and for all the piles of legislation, we're dealing with a bunch of simple munchkins.
Oh, Tom, please don't say that.
People are simple munchkins. Yeah,
But it's just distilling it down to simple. What you're going to say is just simple facts.
Simple facts, and that is people are concerned about performance, and aligned with the performance is incentives and reward. So performance is the first thing. The second thing is keeping regulators away from the door. They're keeping the wolf away from the door. So performance and keeping your nose clean so regulators aren't there.
Otherwise, it's going to impact performance.
And
that's where it comes down to. And it's in any regulated profession. That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to make money, in effect, because that's our jobs, and we're trying to be compliant.
Do it within
keep it compliant, and that's exactly right.
To do it within the acceptable norms that the society has set for you today, be it legislated or be it ethical, right? Yeah, something you could do under law may not be ethical. So the two things need to be taken hand to hand or hand in glove, however you wish to put it. But that's part of it. Yeah, but it
is a lower bar, and it can't be and I think when we're coming back to the TASA, we're trying to regulate, in effect, ethics.
Correct.
And that's where it becomes very hard for someone like the Tax Practitioners Board that's been tasked with implementing it, is how do you actually provide black letter law, to put it into your accounting standard speak, how do we provide black letter law into an ethical framework? And it's, your ethics and my ethics are going to be different because we're different people with our bar. Like when you were talking about the two simple things, they're trying to answer the question, have you stopped stealing from the lolly jar? Sometimes that's the sort of question that is getting asked, and you go, well, we can't give you a black and white answer on that, and that's a whole nother discussion we could have about the binary and the grey area that we're now looking at. So it is a fairly simple beast when you distill it down to profit and compliance. But that's pretty right with everything. And with compliance, we're not talking about legal, we're talking also about ethical.
But you've got to, in saying that, in simplifying it to that level, I'm not denying the complexity of the organisations we're talking about. Because if you're a sole practitioner, you will know what you're doing every day of the week because that's your business. You know what your decision-making process is like. You know the clients you are comfortable with. You know whether you've got you want to ditch your client because they're getting a bit playful with transactions and seeking advice that is inappropriate because it's unethical and breaches one law, two law, or three laws or more. But
what we feel comfortable with, Tommy, or what we would normally feel comfortable with.
Well, that's your internal moral compass.
Exactly.
Right? The minute you get out of the sole practitioner space and into the small to medium practice with several partners and then, however many staff, you begin to get a different, a completely different vibe, because the risk management structure has to be more sophisticated. The processes have to be more sophisticated. People need to look over each other's shoulders to some degree, because it's not one person's practice and sole practitioner's work that poses a risk. There's a whole bunch of people who
But
could
that's when
pose
it
a
comes
risk to
down
each
to
other.
culture, right? That's where it comes down to culture.
Of course,
You
which
know,
is what.
culture comes from the top in any, governance model that we're talking about. So it's
Of course.
getting the right culture, the right fit. When
Well,
you interview for a position there, you've got to make sure the fit's both ways, so to speak. And I believe you can teach anyone anything, but it's very hard to get the right or get the right cultural fit or change someone's culture. Will they work well in that team? And now let's teach them how to do the actual job.
if we go back to the procurement inquiry chaired by Senator Richard Goldberg, they had two bodies of work that they talked about there. One of them was the PwC review done by Ziggy Spitkalski.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other one was a piece of work done by Elizabeth Broderick looking at EY. And those two reports, in their various ways, delved into the culture of large firms and how those firms operate and the changes that need to be made to modify the firm's governance structures so that things are not only done in a way that keeps the business ticking, they're done in a way that is or falls within the accepted norms of the firm under a restructured regime, the laws of the community, and ethical pronouncements, and also the standards and expectations of the broader community as represented by Parliament. I don't think we have that conversation often enough.
Yeah. Agree.
Aside from, picking on tax agents and picking on accounting firms, especially big ones, what else are the things that have crossed your desk during the past 12 months that are worth highlighting?
The other things that seem to come through is really the lack of real fundamental tax changes as well, Tom, that we're looking at.
Okay.
What we're seeing is the ATO bringing out these things called PCGs, Practice Companion Guides, which is really the rules of engagement if they're going to audit a taxpayer. And they're now getting replaced as a quasi sort of bit of legislation because the legislation really isn't quite right. So we're looking at the regulator, the policing of the tax system being the creator of or their interpretation of the tax law a little bit. And so it's quite interesting that the standard operating procedure of the ATO now is to really put out these PCGs, the lack of rulings and things like that, which we can rely on as taxpayers. We're now going, well, here are the rules if we're going to audit you, which is really an interesting thing because it's sort of like, well, where does that sit with your risk? And it sort of overlays with the ethics of the taxpayer and the tax agent, tax lawyer, intermediary as well. So we're seeing those sort of things come through. But when we look at, any really new tax legislation that's come through, there really hasn't been for ages. It's all been around the administrative periphery, which means that the small taxpayers, so the small tax agents have had to do a lot more admin themselves, taking a lot of time, and that's why we need a nice little break at this time of the year as well, where the bigger firms can employ admin people to run their processes. So it's all that sort of thing that's sort of taken up our time and our observations. I sort of
Yeah.
look back, and I've said this to people, and I'm sure I've said this to you in the past. You look at the changes that have occurred over the past 5 years or something like that. They've all been administrative and put administrative burden on. Look at single touch payroll. Look at the COVID stimulus packages, cash flow boost and JobKeeper. Remember those, right? And then we had director identification numbers that all had to come in and change. All these things are coming around the periphery.
Yeah.
And what that all does is bring in this big data matching and AI and everything. So more data is all happening in real time that can come into the regulators and then get spit out as a please explain letter, so to speak, to everyone. So it's quite interesting that that's how the compliance is coming through at the moment. And if you're not IT savvy and IT literate and have all the great cyber security things that you need in your system, you just can't function anymore. You have to look at those sort of things to be able to do anything. You can't you don't talk to anyone anymore. It's all done through portals and online. And that's the growing trend now. So you've got to really identify what's going on.
And let me take the viewers of this back about a decade or so. When I worked at a little place called Taxpayers Australia, and there was a lovely gentleman, and he wasn't the only one, who had continued to do paper-based tax returns, and every year the ATO would give them a paper-based tax returns for the number of clients they had, right? And then complaints started coming in to me by phone that the ATO was talking to clients directly. Well, had the practitioners I'm thinking of actually had a PC on their desk, they would know that the clients would be getting messages through the MyGov portal, from the link with the tax office. And that's how the communication was happening. If they were online with access to a portal, right, they would actually know what was going on. But because they were disconnected from the online world completely, they weren't seeing what was going on. So the ATO would have been doing things that were entirely within the ATO's scope to do, and within the ATO's right to do, in that the taxpayer had clearly linked their tax, their sort of tax affairs to their MyGov ID, and a particular tax agent was none the wiser because they themselves hadn't embraced the technology. What you've just said about AI and other things is people need to be ready to embrace it. Otherwise, they will get out of business very, very quickly.
Yeah, and for all its sake, and it was quite interesting. We had this conversation just taking us back to COVID. Single touch payroll, that was a big deal, and a lot of the software vendors had to do that for us. So
Yep.
the big software vendors had to do it for us. The ATO weren't really in charge of the software as such. It was always coming through for us. But then when you looked at it, to give everyone the COVID stimulus packages, if we didn't have single touch payroll, there's no way that could have gone out the way that it did and saved businesses and saves people's livelihoods, right? So there's good and bad with it all, but it's just a fact of life now. I mean, my Gov ID's changed to my ID, as we know, that it's all changed. And there's always two avenues to a taxpayer. One is through people like myself as being a tax agent, but the other one's directly with MyGov and their
Yep.
MyGov portal. But everyone's just got to be diligent with how they manage all their IT systems. I had a client Christmas dinner the other night, and someone said, "Well, I don't access this and I don't access that," and she goes, "I don't do that because I can't remember all my passwords. So I just have one," and I've just gone, "Oh, good." It's just good password hygiene. We don't have a choice now, Tom. That's the way that we have to communicate, and it is really hard for the older people.
Yeah,
right, who are not digital natives. I mean, I even look at my generation, and you're a bit younger than me. You're probably nearly digital native, but I'm not. My final year of high school, we had one Apple IIe computer in all my school. That was it. And everyone knew how to play the lemonade game on Apple, and that was about it. So even with all of that, you've still got to come to terms with it, and that's the way that we have to do business now. Unfortunately, paper-based is sort of gone, but of course the ATO will still accept them, but they then say, well, we'll respond to you in 60 days instead of 5 days. So that's how they get around it. If you want your refund quick, use digital in 5 days. If you want your refund in paper, it might take 60 days. And as we know, checks are going as well. So
but the point about you make about computers and their evolution. When I was in my early secondary years, which was sort of 84, I'm a De La Salle boy, so that'd be 84. That was the era when things like the Commodore 64 were around. And you would have basic programs you'd be writing little basic programs where you'd make the computer beep and you'd be really impressed with yourself because you managed to follow instructions, which is fun. But yeah, that's the era we're talking. And that I mean,
as with any evolution, you know what they say, they've got to wait till all the old people die. It's sort of a bit of a joke, but we've got to wait for that to evolve. But with that comes a lot of checks and balances, which is our own responsibility to do. Digital signatures, things like that. I think Warren Buffett said something along the lines of, we might have to go back to wet signatures again, right? Even with me, when I send out an e-signature, has that person really signed it or not? It's out of our responsibility to do that. So again, it's what we need to live with and work with and use it for good, not evil.
Yes.
You're not going to respond to that because that could be a whole other hour of our conversation.
I'm trying not to go down the rabbit hole of Marvel comics and Spider-Man right now.
Oh well, it is Christmas, so we're allowed to.
It is Christmas, but with great power comes great responsibility. Speaking of Christmas, before we wrap this thing up, because one of the things people struggle with is how they distract themselves from contemporary events. Now, I have successfully managed to avoid watching too much in the way of news over the past 48 hours. I have watched some interesting stuff on Disney, revisited a Ricky Gervais special on Netflix, watched the movie with Kirsten Dunst released this year called Civil War, which is an interesting look at what happens when people take sides in an environment that is highly politically charged, and the extent to which you can see that happen in places like Gaza and elsewhere is something else. Is another matter. But I speaking for myself, I tend to listen to music and get a moment here and there where I'm stripping a piece of music apart in my head. It can be anything from Tina Turner's The Best to a Billy Joel track to an Elton John track, or, something recorded by Kiss in the ancient era when T Rex walked the earth and Stegosaurus was wandering around.
Not quite, but yeah.
But we're getting there. However, what what are the handful of things that distract you from stuff like tax?
Yeah, it's interesting because, we've all, I mean, I showed my iPhone. I mean, we're always connected. If you really want to detox, do a digital detox, just basically turn off your phone or get somewhere where there isn't reception. And those places are, keep showing your merchandise, Tommy. So I always tend to, and you know this about me, I tend to work every day, but not, absolutely flat out every day because you just wouldn't be able to have the capacity. So I take my little moments of me time, like this morning, right? It's freezing in Melbourne. It is going to be warm tomorrow, but I swim in the bay. Right, I started swimming in pools, and then COVID happened, and we couldn't swim in pools anymore. So I went, okay, let's get a wetsuit and jump in the bay. Now, I am not the most sporty person. I know I've never been sporty, but swimming was one of the things I could do as a kid, right? And out of all the things, I probably swam better than I did other sporty endeavors. So I love swimming, and I find that very, very therapeutic. I like jumping in the water, just doing those sort of things, getting back to the really basics. And that when I swim, everything goes out of your mind, off you go. I also watch far, far, far too much television, but I like that. A little bit of, someone said to me the other day, have you watched The Bear? And The Bear's meant to be really good, Tommy. But when I started watching The Bear, it was too like this. And I go, no. I want to watch stuff where I can just chill when I do things. No, just, I will not watch unscripted drama. I do not believe unscripted drama belongs anywhere like reality TV. I like scripted drama where you've got a story and there's a desired outcome. So I do those sort of things to wind down, but I think it's important that you do. I go to the gym. You know how I like going to Reformer Pilates. You always make a joke about that. But, it's those sort of things to wind down and give you some me time and some peaceful time. And that's what we tend to do.
I guess the other thing I do, and some people think it's sort of crazy, but it is during the day I tend to do a lot of the writing work I do. There is a deliberate decision I take at the point of when it sort of hits early evening that I switch gears and it becomes listening time. And listening time in the context of listen to what other people have to say. And you just take stuff in. You listen to different views and different things that are being said about contemporary events. And that may feel like work, that may sound like work, and to some extent it is. But it's also, a discipline where you listen to learn.
Yeah.
You don't listen to respond. And I don't think in the time that we've had social media around, listening to learn has received as much attention as it should, because the modern mode of communication relies on people engaging. And what gets us engaging? Not necessarily listening to learn, but having arguments with each other on some social media platform.
Or liking or doing some sort of emoji or something like that.
Well, there is that.
But it comes down to, Tom, I always think about people wind down in different ways. Like,
correct.
When you go on holidays, do you go on a holiday where you want to just lie on a beach, or do you want to go on a holiday where you see lots of stuff, right? Do you need a rest after a holiday or not? Depends on how good of a time you've had to something. But it depends. Like, I mean, I went up for the Institute of Public Accountants National Congress the other week up to Port Douglas at the Sheraton Mirage. And I actually I'm not a resort kind of person. Like, why would you travel all that way to just be confined to a swimming pool? And then I just said I swim in the bay. I looked out on the ocean. I go, I can't even swim in that because of the stingers. So I actually felt quite hemmed in and quite claustrophobic in that
you mean you didn't
environment.
like making new friends?
Well, like new friends at the conference. So I have plenty of. I
Oh, but
love
but
my
you
Ivy
just said
mates.
you couldn't swim in the water because of the stingers.
Yeah, the stingers. Yeah, that's exactly right. Yes. So and I wasn't willing to risk it. I know some people jumped into the restricted area, but it's those sort of things that you've got to find what's good for you.
Yeah.
And you know, I actually had a joke with someone when they were taking. Where was I? It must have been down. Just must have been down. It must have been the bathing boxes or something in Brighton where I was swimming. And someone was doing exercises, and there was someone with a flash camera there, you know, taking all these shots and making sure the lights were all there. Lighting was all right. And I just said, "Oh, that's nice. Good luck with the photos, but." Why don't you just put it on a green screen and put something behind? I always laugh about people taking great Instagram shots when we could really do it with a green screen. But maybe that's not the point.
Yeah, you can do things with green screens.
Well, I know your merch. So you've got your merch on, Tom. I actually did product placement myself. I know it's a Tommy Hilfiger top, but I thought, why not put Tommy on if I'm doing this session with you? Thanks to Costco. We love our Costco. Finally became a member and went to Costco Moorabbin, which was great. My very first experience, which was good, as a true member instead of going with my sister-in-law. So it was, look, we've just got to wind down and find time. And the other thing that I think, you know, in terms of New Year's resolutions, if we ever make them, I don't really like them because then you're holding yourself up to fail, which isn't a great thing. But it's more, you know, don't say yes to everything. It's okay to say no. And I think that's really good, especially when you're in, you know, you've got clients that want things on this arbitrary deadline being tomorrow. Like nothing is due tomorrow. There is no, some things might be due on the 31st of December maybe, but not due tomorrow. So you're okay to just go, it's okay. You know, it's, you can push back on your client and go, yeah, let's do that in 2025. It can wait till then. And I've had a lot of conversations over the past couple of days with people saying, I think that's a 2025 problem, which I think is absolutely fine. Okay?
Well, there is a, and we can use this sentiment to close up. I did an interview many moons ago with a senior practitioner in an accounting firm. I asked them, you know, how do the staff in the technical division cope with an escalation of queries? And the response was this: nobody ever died because they didn't get an answer to an accounting problem.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Perspective is critical. Even in the middle of, you know, noise and the dust and other things that get kicked up due to political debate or regulatory change, perspective is critical. Nobody ever died because they didn't get an answer to an accounting problem. Lisa, if people want to know more about you, where do they go?
Probably LinkedIn's probably the best one for me at the moment, Tom. I do need to update my website for the new tacit changes. That's on my to-do list over the next few days as well. But yeah, my LinkedIn profile is all good. If people want to speak to me, contact me, find it interesting. I've got my finger in a lot of little pies, so I like doing a lot of things, but hopefully I don't inundate myself for 2025. It's been a pleasure talking to you, Tommy.
And thank you for joining me for this. I've been talking to Lisa Greig, a tax trainer extraordinaire and, you know, tax agent and a range of other things, too many to name. Thanks for that, Liz.
Thanks, Tommy. Cheers.
And that is the last edition of Ravlic at Large for 2024. I will be back with a raft of new editions of Ravlic at Large in the new year, already starting to book people in for interviews, ministers and others of various types. So stay tuned, keep an eye on my socials, and have a restful break Stay safe, look after each other, don't do anything too silly. And we'll talk to you again fairly soon.